Under One Roof MTL, hosted by Robin Flynn, featuring mortgage brokers Fred and Martin and real estate expert LJ Aguinaga. Presented by Fred and Martin Mortgages and LJ Realties.
Welcome to Under One Roof MTL on CJD 800. I am Robin Flynn. We are with you until 1 p.m. In studio, as always, are Fred Pichette and Martin Spalding of Fred and Martin Mortgages and LJ Aguinaga of LJ Realties, the experts. If you have questions about real estate, mortgages, housing, anything related to your dwelling, you can call us at 514-790-0800 or you can text us at 514-800. We'd be happy to get to your questions as best we can. We do have a question from a listener from last week that we didn't have time to get to, so we'll get to that in just a moment. But first, our trivia question of the week, brought to you by Felix and Norton Cookies. You can visit their store at the Blue Haven Shopping Center, 3705 St. John's Boulevard in DDO. The first person to text in the correct response to 514-800 receives delicious Felix and Norton cookies delivered straight to their door. Our question this week: which Canadian province has the highest average home prices?
That's actually a tough question.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it? It feels like a bit of a gimme this week.
Really?
I don't know. If you
right.
think you know the answer, 514-800 is the number to text into, and make sure you do include your first name so that we know who you are. Guys, how are you doing? It's a beautiful day. I got parking right out front, which makes it feel like the sun is shining even more.
I think
Anyone?
Bueller?
It's doing great. No, it is beautiful. Whenever the sun comes out, it definitely helps with everything going on. It makes it a beautiful day, great to enjoy, and yeah.
Yeah, big plans for the day?
We're going to see my mom with my daughter and my wife later, so we're going to spend some time with my sister who just got back from Vancouver today.
Cool.
And stepdad and mom.
Very nice, very nice.
I just had the big show.
The big show. Well, that's the biggest part of the day, obviously. Guys, we had a text last week from a listener, and we didn't have time to get to it, so we saved it because we wanted to address it. This question is: tenant over the age of 70. Now their granddaughter has moved in. That granddaughter does not work. If the senior tenant decides to move out or if they pass away, can the granddaughter claim the apartment? What is the rule? Does that apartment now belong to them? LJ, I feel like you probably know the answer to this one.
So the answer really comes down to the person move in beforehand. Is this a lease transfer? Because now with Bill 31, there's going to be a bunch of changes, and we'll speak to that effect in a little bit. But if the tenant was already living in the apartment and the person did pass away, in my experience, because it actually happened to me in one of my units, that person has right to the apartment. So you can't just kick them out. There is no reason to believe that they won't be able to pay for it technically. So until they've shown any signs of not being able to pay for it, they actually get to keep the apartment and continue to benefit from it at that point.
Even though their name wasn't on the lease?
Even though their name wasn't on the lease, by proxy of having lived there for an extended period of time, they have automatically become the assumer of this lease, if you will.
Is it by proxy of living there, or is it the relationship that the daughter has with the grandmother?
In my case, it was a caretaker taking care of the person who was living there, who was no direct relationship, and this person had ownership rights or got to keep the unit more so.
And what happened at the end of the lease, the LJ?
The lease, the tenant has the right to renew the lease in perpetuity, right? So in this case, it was a building owned through a corporation, and they are the leaseholders. Therefore, if they want to continue staying there, they get to continue staying there.
Very interesting. So basically, if I had an apartment that I was living in and I had a roommate, but my name was on the lease and I leave, they get to stay.
They're allowed to stay, yes. So unless there's been signs of not being able to pay for the unit, because you mentioned that she doesn't have a job, but doesn't mean she doesn't have savings to cover the apartment, right? So we can't assume that someone won't be able to pay.
So would they have to go through the process of applying for an apartment all over again? Like, would they have to do a credit check, employment verification?
If they were already living there and already part of it, then it's kind of interpreted that this is the case when it was happening. So they're going to be able to take ownership of that unit.
Interesting. If you have questions for LJ, Fred, or Martin, you can text us at 514-800. Do include your name because we like to know who we're speaking to. Glenn just texted us. Good afternoon. In an 8-plex condo building, we have a rule that no condo can be rented. What should we do if a condo goes up for sale, looks at offers from investors who will rent it if they purchase it?
So in this case, if you have a rule in place that says you're not allowed to rent it out, then there should be a provision in your declaration of co-ownership that says what happens if somebody's in breach of contract. Now, typically it'll be a fine per day, per month, etc. that will incentivize somebody to stop this. And if they don't pay the fine, then you get to put a lien on their property and go down that road. So usually if this is a rule in the declaration of co-ownership, most investors aren't going to expose themselves to that kind of risk because it completely defeats the purpose of the investment. If anything, they might speculative purchase it and leave it vacant for a time period in order to take advantage of the appreciation. But if you're in breach of the rules, there are usually penalties to that effect.
Is it possible that paying the penalties might just be, worth it, basically? Like, I think of like Michael Jordan when there was like a rule for shoes that they couldn't be white or whatever, and he just paid the fine to be able to have that deal with Nike and create the Air Jordans because it made more sense for him financially to just pay the fine every game.
In my experience, we usually see this rule with short-term rentals, for example, and it'll be $500 for the first day and then $1,000 per day moving forward. So
Okey-dokey.
I don't know an apartment building in Montreal that'll justify $1,000 a day in penalties.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. You're listening to Under One Roof MTL on CJD 800. That's LJ Aguinaga from LJ Realties. We also have Fred Pichette and Martin Spalding from Fred and Martin Mortgages. You can text us your questions at 514-800. You can also call us at 514-790-0800. We are going to be talking about the average cost of rent, but we do have one more question I want to get to from Romeo that's kind of interesting. Fred and Martin, this one's going to go to you guys. March 11th, I have to renew my mortgage. I'm hearing speculation that in April, there's a chance that interest rates will drop. What can I tell the providers, and how can I extend to maybe wait a few weeks rather than signing right now?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm looking at Fred.
Well,
So there are given dates where the Bank of Canada can adjust the interest rates. And so the next date that's on the docket is March 6th, followed by April 10th, June 5th. If you read what was published this week, most people are pushing forward when the Bank of Canada is going to reduce its overnight rate, which is the bank rate. And they're pushing it till June right now.
Wow.
Because the job market is still very healthy. Inflation, even if it dipped in January, it's not a clear indicator that we're actually gotten inflation under control. So, we don't have a mirror ball.
right.
Not a mirror ball, a crystal ball. But from what we're reading, it's more June, July.
I think for Romeo, I will potentially say not to renew your mortgage, but to go to an open mortgage. A open mortgage, you will pay more interest for the next 2-3 months, but at least if the rate goes down in June or July, you will be able to lock it up at a good rate. That would be a pretty good option if you have to renew right now.
What are your thoughts about a variable mortgage short term?
I think if you really want to hedge the market and see that the interest rate will potentially goes down in 2025 at the beginning, I will go variable right now. Why? Because obviously, as Martin says, all the economists really says that the interest rate will start to go down in June. Hopefully, it will be in March, like all the people want. But again, it's not going to happen in March, which is going variable. It'll give you a lot of option to secure a good rate later on.
Interesting. You know what you should do, Romeo? You should get in touch with Fred. Go to fredandmartin.com and discuss this with a real mortgage broker who can give you your options and look at your situation and address what your concerns are on a one-on-one conversation basis. It won't cost you anything to give Fred a call. So just go to fredandmartin.com for more information. That's the best thing you could do right now. Guys, I mentioned it. The average cost of rent right now in Canada has hit an all-time record, $2,200 a month. $2,200. If you're somebody who's just a regular, has a bachelor's, working in an office, making $50,000 a year, that's your entire income. That doesn't leave anything for groceries, cell phones. You need to have a partner or a roommate to be able to afford the average rent right now. That seems crazy.
It was funny because in our production meeting this week, we talked about this and we talked about 2,200. And where is the inflection point? Where is that tipping point where it doesn't pay to rent anymore and that you should actually get into the real estate market and buy yourself something? And it was actually Fred that brought it up and said, you know what, at 2,200, you're pretty close. Put aside down payment, closing costs. You're pretty close to buying yourself something decent. And it doesn't have to be your forever home. You just need to get into the market. You just got to get a property. And by getting a property, you start to build equity. And by building equity, then, in 3 to 5 years from now, you sell that property, use that equity to buy something else, and so on and so forth.
As a mortgage broker, I love to encourage my clients to to get yourself pre-approved. Basically, it's so important. Like paying rent, you're actually paying the mortgage of someone else. It is a temporary option. I understand, but again, getting ownership, it's key. It's the first creation of wealth in Canada.
And Fred often says this: get pre-approved with documentation to support the application, because you can go on a lot of websites and get pre-qualified. That's garbage.
It's garbage. Put it in the trash.
Exactly, it's garbage.
Yes, we gotta throw it in the trash.
So get pre-qualified or get pre-approved with documentation, so you know going in what you can afford.
This is Under One Roof MTL on CJD 800. Still to come, everything you need to know about home insurance and what exactly is a land transfer duty.
Under One Roof MTL, hosted by Robin Flynn, featuring mortgage brokers Fred and Martin and real estate expert LJ Aguinaga. Presented by Fred and Martin Mortgages and LJ Realties.
This is your lingo lexicon on Under One Roof MTL. Land transfer duty. More commonly known as a welcome tax, a land transfer duty is a tax imposed by provinces on the transfer of real estate property. The land transfer tax is usually calculated based on the purchase price of the property. So, where does the money go? The welcome tax serves to provide municipalities with income to support infrastructure like schools, parks, roads, and public services. How much you pay depends on both the municipality and the property's valuation, with the higher property value resulting in a higher welcome tax. When is payment due? Depends on the city, but most municipalities require payment within 30 days of your closing date. This has been your Lingo Lexicon on Under One Roof MTL. I'm Robin Flynn. We are with you until 1 p.m. I'm with Fred Pichette and Martin Spalding from Fred and Martin Mortgages, LJ Aguinaga from LJ Realties. We're trying to get in touch with Curtis Killen, president at KBD Insurance, to hopefully answer some of your home insurance questions. And I do see that we have a couple questions pertaining to insurance. So we'll hold off on those ones until we can get in touch with Curtis. But in the meantime, we have a few other questions coming in. And if you have questions for the experts, 514-800 is the number to text, or you can call us at 514-790-0800. This text has come in from Sasha. I will need to leave my apartment due to major repairs for the next 3 to 6 months. We will need to find a place to live during this time. Rent has greatly increased. Who is responsible for finding a location for us to live in during this time? And what are the landlords versus our obligations in terms of what we have to pay?
Okay, so the first question I'm going to ask is, do you have insurance? Because if you have tenants insurance, which you, at least in all my buildings, I require all of our tenants to have, it will help protect you. It'll help alleviate the next set of responsibilities. The second question to that is, are you leaving due to the owner of the building simply wanted to do improvements to the property? Or has there been a flood, a fire, some sort of major event that's requiring you to move out? And depending on what the answer is here is really going to play a huge role on what the response is going to be. Assuming that it is an emergency, your insurance is the best bet, obviously. They will hopefully find a place to put you up. It'll usually be a short-term place, and off we go with that. In the event that the landlord needs to do, let's say, a foundation repair, because it's simply, we're in Montreal, properties are 100 years old, it happens. At that point, it's usually a shared responsibility. You can start looking for places, and if it's the landlord's responsibility to move you out, well, he has to take care and compensate you for this next phase of what's going to happen in the property. Therefore, you are responsible for continuing to pay your rent, the same amount you have been paying, and you need to be put in a place that is acceptable of similar regard to your current property.
But what happens if you can't find an apartment for the same as what you were paying? Does the landlord then have to pay the difference?
Correct.
Okay, that makes sense. Fred?
And how can you find an apartment for 3 months or 6 months? Could be very hard.
It'll usually be a short-term rental space.
So like Airbnb or something like that?
There's dedicated buildings for short-term rentals as well that have 30-day minimums on it. So you'll have a lot of places that are set up for this in particular. You have Sonder spaces. You have a couple of buildings that'll do this regularly as well.
Very interesting. We have another text from Evgeny. He says, what are the requirements for repossessing an apartment? It's for my son to live in. I heard that if you have a tenant that's lived there for over 10 years, it's hard to do. What can we do about it?
So there's a couple of things. The 10-year rule isn't just strictly a 10-year rule. You have to be either 70 years old or more, have lived in the apartment for 10 years or longer, and earned less than X amount of dollars. That X amount is usually, I believe, about 40. It's a line that's set by the City of Montreal every single year. So if you meet these three criteria, then you cannot repossess the property from them unless you are putting in somebody who meets similar criteria. So possibly a parent who's over 70, somebody who you're responsible for who meets similar criteria. So it's not just one or the other. It's really all three of the criteria. That's super important here. And we're seeing some changes to this in Bill 31, but the criteria has remained the same for that at least.
Okay, speaking of Bill 31, we're getting a few questions that are kind of pertaining to some of the items in Bill 31. I sent you guys all a news article this week. Did you read it? The news article about? Okay, very good. Just making sure you guys did your homework. I'm a very strict teacher. Okay, so a couple questions here. What are the new laws regarding repossessing an apartment?
So what's primarily changed is the fact that you now have to compensate the tenant if you will repossess the unit, which was not necessarily the case prior to now.
Okay.
So if you are repossessing the unit for your own use or for a parent or for a child's use, you now have to compensate the tenant 1 month's rent for every year they have lived in the apartment, up to a maximum of 24 months and a minimum of 3 months. So if the proper person's been there for 2 years, you still have to pay them 3 months rent plus reasonable moving costs. Now, determining reasonable moving costs is going to be based on a couple quotes possibly, but that is what the new law states. And if somebody's been there for 24 years, then they're eligible for 2 years worth of rent essentially in compensation plus the reasonable moving costs.
Oh, wow. Very interesting. What else is in this Bill 31 that we need to know about? I know I've seen some people talking about lease transfers.
So that's a huge thing. Now, a landlord used to have to require a significant reason in order to block a lease transfer. At this point, a landlord can simply say, no, I refuse your lease transfer. You are allowed to leave on the date that you've stipulated on your agreement, but I'm going to take back the property and I'm going to do what I want with this property now.
And when we say do what I want, what does that mean? Like find your own tenant?
Find my own tenant, renovate it, put somebody I want in there, simply re-rent it. I no longer have any responsibilities to the previous tenant.
But it goes further than that, though. But because if a tenant actually calls the landlord and says, I would like to transfer the lease to somebody, the landlord could immediately refuse and evict the person that has made the steps to transfer their lease to somebody else.
In terms of refusal, the tenant who's looking to transfer the lease is essentially wanting out of their lease, right? They want to move on to another property, they're leaving the country, whatever it might be. The landlord now just gets back the right to say, no, I want to take it back on your date of transfer. We can't automatically kick them out in 15 or 30 days. Whatever date that they had proposed for that lease transfer becomes the new effective lease end date.
Okay.
But what do you think, guys, about it? Because I think as a landlord, you don't want your tenant to transfer it to anybody.
I think it's...
Would you let one of your tenants to transfer it to someone that you don't know?
So we've always run basically a very systematic approach. We always have every single tenant fill out a credit application. We do a criminal background check on them, a civil check on them. And what we tell everybody is that you can transfer your lease, at least historically, because this was the previous law, so long as the candidate passes the exact same verifications that you went through. And we give them the exact same forms. They go through the same verification process. And if they did pass it, well, then as far as I was concerned, no problem, because we continue to receive our rent. Everybody's happy.
Right.
In this case, because a lot of properties in Montreal have seen a significant change in their rental value versus what they've been collecting, you're going to see a lot of landlords start blocking this because they want to catch up to a certain portion of market rent that has been lost, or take the opportunity to do renovations in buildings because, like you mentioned, some properties do need major repairs. They haven't been able to necessarily afford paying to put up a tenant elsewhere for 3 to 6 months and do the repairs as well. So take advantage of this to do these major repairs without having to worry about that, and then follow the new rental board calculation for calculating that rental adjustment.
Okay.
Also, what we could say is, back in the day, 5 years ago, the interest rate was around 2%. Now a landlord has to pay approximately 6 to 7% on his rental property. It increases his financial
obligations and carrying costs 100%. And
yeah.
Interest, unfortunately, isn't one of the things that the rental board looks at when calculating rental adjustments. And that's hard. That's really hurt most landlords in the last couple of years because we can adjust for maintenance, improvements, renovations, management fees, etc. But when you're not adjusting for that interest rate, anybody who was on a variable rate and their interest doubled effectively, their payments went up possibly $2,000 a month, $3,000 a month. If you're not collecting more rent, it's obviously a huge financial strain on the landlord.
I've got a loaded question here.
Oh boy.
And I'm looking over at LJ, and I hope you. So you could debate the pros and cons on both sides of the ledger. You could debate that this is fair for the landlords because interest rates have gone up. You could say that it's fair enough for the tenants, or vice versa. Where do you sit with Bill? Where do you sit with Bill 31?
I'm quite happy with the provisions and the changes that have been brought forth.
Do you think they're fair?
I think they're fair. I think that it allows landlords to gain a little bit of control in a province that is usually very tenant friendly. When we compare every other province across Canada, even every state in the U.S., Quebec has the strictest tenant favoring laws. And it never sat well with me that a tenant got to decide who the next occupant of my property was going to be. How is it that the tenant who hasn't invested the down payment, hasn't carried the cost of the property, ultimate deciding power on who gets to live in this property?
Fair enough.
I think it's fair to say that this law, Bill 31, won't be accepted by all. Like it's impossible. On one side you have the landlord, and the other side you have the tenant. I think a lot of people will still complain about it. Like,
we're going to have complaints regardless of what changes we bring forth to any law. There's always going to be two sides to the coin. Obviously, it's going to depend on what side of the fence you're going to sit on. Nevertheless, I think that by bringing forth compensation to tenants when repossessions are happening, their rights have now been acknowledged, and we now have a formal system for deciding what this is. This used to always be, first of all, there was no compensation other than reasonable moving costs, and secondly, it could be a conversation to decide what was fair. We now have at least a system in place that everyone can respect and state this is what the compensation is.
You're listening to Under One Roof MTL on CJD 800. That's LJ Aguinaga from LJ Realties, Fred Pichette and Martin Spalding from Fred and Martin Mortgages. Keep those questions coming in, 514-800. You can also call us at 514-790-0800. Coming up after the news, inflation is dropping faster than expected. What does that mean for interest rates? We'll find out next.
Under One Roof MTL, hosted by Robin Flynn, featuring mortgage brokers Fred and Martin and real estate expert LJ Aguinaga. Presented by Fred and Martin Mortgages and LJ Realties. This is the Mortgage Minute.
What are first, second, and even third ranked mortgages? This is your Mortgage Minute. Today, we are focusing on the differences between a first, second, and third rank mortgage. These rankings are crucial in determining the order of repayment in situations like payment default or the sale of a property. A first-rank mortgage is essentially the primary loan you secure when purchasing a property. It stands at the forefront of the repayment hierarchy, meaning if things go south and you're unable to pay back your loan, or if you decide to sell your property, the money goes first to settling a first-rank mortgage. Given its position, it generally comes with the most favorable conditions, i.e., lowest interest rate. This is because, from a lender's point of view, it's the least risky. Moving to a second-rank mortgage, this comes into play when you decide to borrow against the equity you've already built in your property beyond what you owe on your first-rank mortgage. The key point here is the increase in risk from the lender's point of view, which translates into a higher interest rate for you. The reason, in the event of default, lenders of second-rank mortgages only get paid after the first-rank mortgage is fully settled. Lastly, we have a third-rank mortgage, which are less common and carry an even higher risk for lenders. Consequently, they come with the highest interest rate. The repayment to this tier only happens after both the first and second-rank mortgages have been paid. The repayment to this tier only happens after both the first and second-rank mortgages have been paid. As we move from first to third-rank mortgages, the risk for lenders increases, and so do the interest rates for borrowers. This tiered structure is a critical aspect of property financing, showing just how important it is to think carefully if you're thinking about getting more than one mortgage on your property. This tiered structure is a critical aspect of property financing, showing just how important it is to think carefully if you're thinking about getting more than just one mortgage on your property.
This is Under One Roof MTL on CJD 800. We are with you until 1 p.m. If you have questions for Fred, Martin, and LJ, you can text them at 514-800 or you can call us at 514-790-0800. You can also answer our trivia question of the week. Which Canadian province has the highest average home prices? If you think you know, 514-800. Do include your name if you actually want to have a chance at winning, guys. We will announce our winner before we wrap up at 1 p.m. Guys, we have a ton of questions coming in. I want to start with this one, though, because it's a follow-up question from Evgeny, who had asked a question earlier. So he says that through Bill 31, as we mentioned, a landlord needs to compensate 1 month rent per year lived. Evgeny's follow-up question, though, is based on which rent costs, what you were charging them at the start of their lease or the last renewal rent cost?
Given the fact that Bill 31 was implemented on Wednesday, and I still haven't seen the actual bill printed out and what we're going to receive. My expectation is going to be that it's based on the most recent rent paid, because that's the reflection of where we're at today when the repossession is going to happen. But I have not double checked that, so feel free to call the rental board, the TAL, to confirm.
All right, we have another question. Can I get a home equity loan in Canada if I own a fully paid off foreign property? In this case, that foreign property is in Costa Rica.
Well, technically, if the property is in Costa Rica, you can't have a bank or a lender involved in Costa Rica from Canada. Like, I would say no. Again, maybe if you have an option over there to take a private loan in Costa Rica, that's what I would look at. But there's no bank in Canada that will take a lien on a property in another country like that, like Costa Rica.
I guess like a Canadian bank would have no jurisdiction in another country, right?
No, and Canadian banks are always going to take the safe option. They like to be very
Right.
conservative when it comes to this, so anything that goes off the traditional path, they're usually simply going to say no.
Speaking of other countries, somebody texted in, what happens when a tenant moves into if two tenants signed a lease and one moves out, leaves the country, is he still liable to pay his portion of the rent till the end of the lease? What if he's refusing to pay? The other party, who's also on the lease, are they liable to pay their roommate's portion? And do I have to go to the régie to garnish the wages?
So the answer to that is the person is responsible. A lease is a contract, and they're responsible for paying their rent. However, on page 3 of the lease, in section H, just below where the signature section is, there's a statement that says the lessees undertake to be solidarily liable for the lease. And you have the box to say yes or no, and then you have to have the tenants initial it. If this box was ticked off yes, then each roommate is responsible for the whole lease, regardless of who's doing it. If that box was not ticked off, or if no was ticked off, then one person is responsible for their half, the other person is responsible for their half, and you cannot kind of cross-collateralize them.
Although, as someone who used to rent a lot, I had never had a single lease where that wasn't checked off yes.
100%.
Like basically,
That is
me and my
standard
roommate.
practice.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a mortgage. You're both responsible for the full amount. Like,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Somebody else texts him, what happens when a tenant moves into a 2-bedroom apartment and states that she wants to live there alone, and that's why you approved her application, but then a few months later, a man and child move in with her. Do they have to be put on the lease, or can the landlord say, no, they can't move into your apartment?
I don't see a scenario where they can be told no, they cannot move into the apartment. You'd have to have some very strong reasoning behind this, really causing damage to the property or to the inhabitants therein. One person, it's totally normal for somebody to move into the property, especially a 2-bedroom apartment, and then eventually they find a partner and somebody else moves into the space. I'd have more of an issue with it if we were talking about a studio or a 1-bedroom and all of a sudden you have 4+ people living in there. Then there's a different jurisdiction to discuss. But one person who has a 2-bedroom apartment moves in, just because you were looking for more peace and quiet, we now start to get into discrimination laws if you were to try to block them because a child's going to be living above you.
Yeah, that's a common one. I've had friends with kids who are renting and they get complaints from their downstairs neighbor because you can hear little tiny footsteps, which they could be tiny, but those footsteps make a lot of noise, right?
Unfortunately, that's totally normal.
Yeah, when you're renting and you're living in downtown, like if you want the quiet life, go to the suburbs, right?
Yeah.
You get what you pay for.
But does that have anything to do with the relationship between the person that rented the 2-bedroom and the father and daughter that are moving in? Is it let's say they're in a relationship, that makes a lot of sense, but let's say she is now subletting the second room and she's got a lease with the second person that's moved in with the father and the daughter. Is it a relationship thing or is it a transactional thing?
We'd have to get a bit more details. It's possible that if the person's now profiting from that, let's say charging a spread and making a profit on this, there might be a case to go into the rental board and kind of discuss what the options were and see it that way. I believe in this example, or the more common one, it's simply somebody else has moved into them and they might be splitting the rent, but she's responsible she's the leaseholder.
Ultimately.
She's the person who's remaining responsibility on it. And quite commonly what we see in this case, especially with most of my tenants, is that come time for renewal, they'll say, oh, by the way, my boyfriend or girlfriend has now moved in. Can you please add them to the lease? And I say, sure, you guys have been paying your rent this entire period. I haven't had any additional complaints. We'll add them to the lease at that point in time.
Is it beneficial to add your partner to the lease? Or does it really matter at the end of the day?
Beneficial to who?
I guess to the person who is not on the lease, you want your name on the lease for the protection that it provides, correct?
Correct. You want to be on a lease when possible. If you want to have right to the space, obviously, in case something goes awry, you want to have your right to stay in that property. It also allows you to use it for when applying for different things. You usually need to show proof of insurance or proof that you have been paying rent somewhere, especially if you potentially on some new arrival programs, you want to show that you've been paying rent for the last couple of months, and that's part of your good credit history, if you will. So you need to be on a lease in order to be able to prove that. So there are a lot of benefits as a tenant to being on a lease. And as a landlord as well, if you have a second person that's now solidarily liable on the lease, well, we now have two people, two incomes to ensure that the rent will be paid.
We still have more questions coming in, so we're going to try and squeeze them in before we wrap up at 1 p.m. You are listening to Under One Roof MTL on CJD 800. By the way, if you want to call in with your questions, you can as well. We'd love to chat with you. 514-790-0800 is the number to call.
Under One Roof MTL, hosted by Robin Flynn, featuring mortgage brokers Fred and Martin and real estate expert LJ Aguinaga. Presented by Fred and Martin Mortgages and LJ Realties.
You are listening to Under One Roof MTL on CJD 800. I'm Robin Flynn with LJ, Fred, and Martin. We are with you until 1 p.m. Keep those questions coming in at 514-800. Before we get back to answering some of your questions, why don't we highlight a property of the week? Because I suspect that LJ is going to have some sort of delicious recommendation in there.
You know me well, Robin. You know me well. So this week I want to highlight 746 First Avenue, Apartment 4 in Lachine. It's a beautiful two-bedroom condo spread over 867 square feet with an indoor garage. It's strategically located between Highway 20 and the Lachine Canal. The unit was built in 2013. Our asking price is $415,000. And one of my favorite features is the kids park right behind the property, right off the balcony. So it's beautiful. My favorite nearby eatery is Falafel Saint Jacques, offering a variety of plant-based options.
Oh, I love a good falafel.
Look at that.
So good. So good. Did you share this on Instagram this week? Because I feel like I looked at this property.
I did. We just listed it this week. So.
Yeah. So I looked at it. So I follow LJ on Instagram, as you should too. And because even though I own my home and I'm not looking to buy a home, I don't know why, I'm obsessed with looking at real estate photos. Like, I just want to see the insides of people's houses. I don't know if that makes me a creeper, but
it's totally normal. It's voyeurism. Everybody wants to see how the people live, what spaces look like, and what's happening.
It is kind of creepy, Robin.
It is creepy. It gives me ideas on what I want to do with my home. I love looking at like bathrooms and kitchens and being like, oh, that's really cool. I should do that.
Do you ever have the reaction you go, I can't believe they picked that color?
Oh, all the time. Or I look at like a really nice like landscaping situation in the backyard and I'm like, ooh, that was expensive because I need to redo my deck and it's going to cost me a lot of money because lumber, guys, it's expensive. Okay, so we do have our trivia question of the week. We're going to get our answer to that for you very, very shortly, but we have a bunch of questions. This one is labeled as urgent from Suzanne, so why don't we try and get to it? She says, I am 74. I've been renting my apartment for 15 years. Yesterday, my landlord raised my rent by $35. The other two tenants got a rent increase as well, but their rent increase was only $20 a month. Of course, they're paying a higher rent than I am, but is it discriminatory to increase me by more because of that? I've been an A1 clean tenant. I feel like this is abusive.
The answer is it comes down to, so rental increases aren't a fixed percentage. The rental board will always tell us year over year what it looks like roughly this year depending on certain criteria. But the only way to actually understand what a rental board will accept is by using the TL rental fixation calculator.
Right.
So is it discriminative? It depends on if your unit actually calculates to that amount and he wants to bring it closer to market value by doing that. And he feels that the other units are already closer to market rent and therefore didn't feel the need to go as high as an increase on those units to risk potentially them wanting to move out and then having to find new tenants, hire a broker for that, and then having to pay commissions, etc. So it's not necessarily discriminative. It really depends on what the calculation was to get to that number.
And LJ, I think this year is you could increase it up to 4%, right?
4.6 is what the rental board actually said is the standard this year. Again, there will be certain exceptions. Depends if you're electric heating, gas heating, oil heating, etc.
Right.
But that's the rough approximation the rental board has given us this year.
It's funny. That question is very good because my father had sold his house. He's, 89 years old.
Nice.
And he's renting right now. And he told me that yesterday. He says, my landlord came and he says he has right to increase it up to 4.6. And he got an increase of 3.6. And it says, well, it's great because I think we're going to talk about it on the show. It says that.
Yeah. Exactly. Great. More questions coming in at 514-800. My tenant hasn't paid rent in 6 months. I need to renovate the property. What do I have to do to evict him? Do I still have to pay the tenant to find a new place?
So if your tenant hasn't paid rent, the rental board law is that as of 21 days of no payment or late payment more so, you're allowed to open a case at the rental board to evict them due to non-payment and frequent late payment if that was the case as well. So 21 days is really the trigger day where the rental board will do something about it, if you will. The tenant is still allowed to pay the owed rent before the actual hearing, and then you can now present your case to the judge. But in this case, if the tenant has not paid on day 21, I've made it good practice to go ahead and open a case at the rental board, because unfortunately, usually that's a sign that things are not going to be going well for a while, and people will start to take advantage of you, take you along for the ride, and unfortunately 3, 4, 5, 6 months later still haven't paid. And now collecting 6 months is going to be a lot more difficult. It'll still take a month or two before we actually get the tenants out. Therefore, best practice, 21 days, you send the letter, and if they do pay, well, they're just going to reimburse you the $85 for opening the case.
Okay. This person also texted in, hello, is it normal for a landlord to send my renewal via bailiff who slipped it under my door?
So you need to send renewal letters by one of the accepted formats. One of them is obviously going to see you in person. One of them is registered mail, and the other one is bailiff. So it depends on if they wanted to make it best practice, if they recently got burnt with a few other tenants because they didn't accept the way it was delivered and whatnot. So it really depends, but it's very much acceptable and allowed.
Interesting. I've never had a renewal arrive via bailiff. Like, it was always registered mail. That was the standard.
Yeah, that seems a little hostile.
It does, right?
Maybe they own a bailiff company.
Maybe.
Oh, there you go.
Or maybe, I guess if you send something registered mail and the tenant just refuses to sign, then they never receive the renewal. Is that a thing that happens?
If you went and did the registered mail, you are protected by the rental board. Your obligation is to try and send it in a respectable way.
Okay.
If the tenant never decides to open it and receive it, I can leave notices at somebody's door as well. The bailiff is the one way that is 100%. They're going to prove that they tried to do it, and it is acceptable in court as well.
All right, makes sense. 514-800 if you have questions for LJ, Fred, or Martin. Fred or Martin are just sitting here twiddling their thumbs. LJ is just answering all the questions.
I mean, we're learning so much today.
Exactly. That's why I love doing this show with you guys. I leave and I feel smarter, and I love not being the smartest person in the room. Every time I leave, I feel like I've learned something, and that makes it a lot of fun. If ever you guys have any questions that you would like answered, 514-790-0800 is the number you can call, 514-800. Maybe we can squeeze in one more question before we wrap up, guys. Tenant left in November. I had a new tenant move in December. Who gets the RL31 slip?
The RL31 slips only get sent out to the tenant who occupied the immovable on December 31st.
So the tenant who only lived there for 1 month.
For 1 day even. It doesn't matter. Whoever lives in the apartment on December 31st, they're the ones who get the RL31 slip.
And that's the slip that you send for tax purposes, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So the other tenant then has no...
They're going to get it from their new landlord.
Okay.
And if they bought a property, then they don't get one anymore.
Or if they moved in with their parents or whatever, they don't get one.
Yep.
So that's not fun for their taxes, I guess.
You can still disclose the fact that you paid rent over that period.
Okay, you don't need a slip. Okay. See, I'm learning something, you guys. Every week. I absolutely love it. That's pretty much almost it for us. We have to get to the answer to our trivia question, though, before I forget. Brought to you by Felix and Norton Cookies. You can visit their store at the Blue Haven Shopping Center, 3705 St. John's Boulevard in DDO. The question this week was, which Canadian province has the highest average home prices? The answer is British Columbia. BC has the highest average home prices in Canada. Noel in Saint Laurent is our winner this week. So Noel, I already texted you. We will need all your information so we can get some delicious cookies to your door. What did we learn this week? I wrote down one main thing, basically that Bill 31 has changed rental responsibilities for both landlords and tenants in Quebec, and it's very important to educate yourself. You can do that by listening to Under One Roof MTL. The show is podcasted on all the major streaming platforms, so you can check it out afterwards if you missed our conversation on that earlier. Guys, how can people reach you? Let's start with you, LJ.
You can go on my website, ljrealties.com. You can also find me on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, X. My handle is Aguinaga. For more information on our listings and real estate team under the handle LJ Realties, we are looking for more real estate brokers right now, so feel free to reach out. And you can always call or text me at 514-500-4040.
Perfect. Fred and Martin, how can people get in touch with you?
We talked a lot about rent. Mm-hmm. So if you want to see if you can get pre-approved for a mortgage, look us up, fredmartin.com.
FredMartin.com is the best way to get in touch. You guys have new blog posts every Tuesday, too. If you're like me and you're a huge dork and you like learning things, you can check out their blog, which is a lot of fun. If you missed anything, as I said, you can find the show in its entirety on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcast, you'll be able to find us. If you want to get in touch with me because you need somebody to run your social media or produce your podcast or just learn more about digital marketing in general, you can check my website out at robinflynn.com. For LJ, Fred, and Martin, I'm Robin Flynn. This This has been Under One Roof MTL.
Under One Roof MTL, hosted by Robin Flynn, featuring mortgage brokers Fred and Martin and real estate expert LJ Aguinaga. Presented by Fred and Martin Mortgages and LJ Realties.